The flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror weren't new, just another routine stop, another excuse. She knew the drill. Hands visible, voice calm, no sudden movements. But as cold metal cuffs clamped around her wrists, she wondered if they saw her at all. Days later, those same officers would stand in a courtroom, their smirks fading as she took the bench. This time, she held the power. The night air was thick with humidity, the city lights casting long shadows on the nearly empty road. She drove steadily, her hands at 10 and 2, her posture composed. The day had been long, and she was eager to get home, to shed the weight of her responsibilities, but a creeping sense of unease settled in her chest. A glance in the rearview mirror confirmed it. A police cruiser followed closely behind her, its headlights glaring in the darkness. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run a light. There was no reason for them to be trailing her. Yet after years of experience, she knew better than to assume fairness would dictate what happened next. The flash of red and blue lights suddenly lit up the night. The siren blaring just once. A command, not a request. Her stomach clenched, but her face remained impassive. She signaled and pulled over to the curb, exhaling slowly before resting her hands on the steering wheel, clearly visible. Two officers approached, their silhouettes tall and imposing in the glow of the streetlights. One tapped aggressively on her window. "License and registration," he barked before she had even rolled it down fully. She complied without a word, reaching carefully into her purse, her movements deliberate. She knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. She handed over her ID and the car's registration, waiting as the officer scrutinized them under the beam of his flashlight. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone even. "Broken taillight," the second cop said, smirking. She knew for a fact that wasn't true. She had checked her car just yesterday, but arguing would be pointless. "This your car?" the first officer asked, his eyes flicking between her face and the documents. "Yes." "Where are you headed?" "Home." The second cop circled her vehicle, shining his flashlight inside, pausing at her briefcase in the passenger seat. "You got anything in the car we should know about?" "No. You sure about that?" His voice carried that sharp edge she'd heard too many times before, the one laced with unspoken threats. "I'm sure." The first officer let out a huff, shaking his head. "Step out of the car." She hesitated, knowing this wasn't routine. They had no reason to make her get out, but refusal would only escalate things. With careful movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. Before she could fully stand, rough hands grabbed her arm. "Turn around," one of them ordered. Her pulse quickened. "Am I being detained?" "You're resisting." That was all it took. Before she could protest, cold metal clamped around her wrists. A sharp click of the cuffs. The street was empty. No witnesses. Just her and them. One of the officers chuckled as he shoved her toward the patrol car. "Bet you never thought your night would end like this, huh?" The room was thick with tension, the kind that made even the air feel heavier. The officers sat rigid, their bodies betraying the nerves they desperately tried to mask. Their lawyer adjusted his tie, clearing his throat, trying to maintain the confidence that had drained from his clients' faces the moment they recognized the woman on the bench. She let the silence stretch, her eyes sweeping over the courtroom. The weight of her gaze alone seemed to shrink the officers in their seats. Gone were the smug grins they had worn just days ago when they threw her into the back of their patrol car like she was nothing. Now, in the harsh glow of the courtroom, they looked much smaller than they had that night. "Well?" she prompted, her voice cool, controlled. The defense attorney finally found his voice. "Your Honor, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. My clients were merely following standard procedure." Her expression didn't change. "Standard procedure?" She tapped a manicured finger against the bench. "Let's discuss that." She turned to the prosecutor. "Please read back the officer's report from the night in question." The prosecutor nodded, lifting a document from his folder. He adjusted his glasses before speaking. "The report states that the suspect was pulled over for a broken taillight." He paused, glancing at her before continuing. "However, a post-incident vehicle inspection confirmed that both taillights were in perfect working condition." The judge remained expressionless, but her eyes flicked toward the officers. They avoided her gaze. "Furthermore," the prosecutor continued, "the officers claimed the suspect was uncooperative and resisted arrest. However, Body camera footage, now entered into evidence, shows that she complied fully with all commands. A few gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. The officer's jaws tightened. "Tell me," she said, her voice steady, "was I resisting arrest when I asked why I was being detained?" Neither officer spoke. "Was I uncooperative when I handed over my license and registration without hesitation?" Still, silence. She leaned forward slightly, her presence suffocating. "Was I a threat when I stood there, hands visible, while you cuffed me?" The second officer, the one who had smirked at her in the street that night, cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. We weren't aware." She cut him off with a look so sharp it could slice through steel. "You weren't aware of what? That I was a judge? That I had power? That I wasn't someone you could throw into the system without consequence?" Neither of them answered. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. "The truth is," she said, her voice softer now but no less sharp, "you weren't following procedure. You were following prejudice." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The officers sat motionless, the weight of their actions pressing down on them. And for the first time, they understood. Justice had finally caught up to them. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft rustling of papers and the distant echo of footsteps in the hall. The officers sat stiffly at the defendant's table, their faces pale, their arrogance now replaced with a cold, creeping fear. They had walked into this courtroom expecting another routine hearing, a slap on the wrist at worst. Instead, they had found themselves face to face with the very woman they had demeaned, arrested, and tossed into the back of their patrol car. And now she held the gavel. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at them, her expression unreadable. "We will now review the evidence," she announced, her voice carrying effortlessly through the silent courtroom. "Prosecution, please proceed." The prosecutor nodded and pressed a button on the courtroom's display system. A large screen flickered to life. "This is footage from the body cameras of Officers Connolly and Morris on the night in question." The video began to play. The officers in the footage were seen pulling over a car. The driver, the judge herself, appeared calm, her hands on the steering wheel. "License and registration," one of the officers barked. The footage showed her handing them over without hesitation. "What's the problem, officer?" her voice asked from the video. "Broken taillight," the second officer replied. The judge in real time kept her face composed, but the courtroom knew what was coming. The prosecutor paused the video. "As established earlier, no taillight was broken. This was a false claim made by the officers." He resumed the footage. The courtroom watched as the officers ordered her out of the vehicle. Even through the grainy body cam footage, the forcefulness in their handling of her was evident. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "She was completely compliant," the prosecutor said, pausing the video. "And yet, they claimed she was resisting." The defense attorney stood. "Your Honor, my clients had no way of knowing who they were dealing with. This was not about race or bias. It was..." The judge lifted a single hand and he fell silent. "You're right," she said slowly. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't know I was a judge. You didn't know I had the power to hold you accountable." She paused, letting her words settle over them. "But that's exactly the problem, isn't it? If I had been any other black woman that night, someone without a title, without influence, what would have happened to me?" Neither officer spoke. The judge turned back to the prosecutor. "Continue." The next piece of evidence was a pattern of complaints against the officers. Racial profiling, unnecessary force, intimidation tactics, all dismissed. "You've done this before," she said, looking directly at them. "Many times." For the first time, they had no defense, no badge to hide behind, no power to abuse, and for the first time, justice was staring them in the face. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent as the final piece of evidence was presented. The body cam footage had already exposed the truth, but the revelation of prior complaints against the officers had sealed their fate. No longer could they argue that this was a misunderstanding or a misjudgment. The pattern was clear. The abuse was undeniable. The judge took a deep breath, her hands resting on the bench. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But she did not waver. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, and now justice had finally caught up to the men who believed they were untouchable. She turned her gaze to the officers, who sat stiffly at the defendant's table, their once smug expressions now drained of all confidence. For the first time, they were truly afraid. Not of a suspect on the street, not of the people they had mistreated, but of accountability. "Stand," she ordered. The officers hesitated, then rose, their lawyer looking like he wanted to object, but knowing there was nothing left to say. The judge inhaled slowly, then spoke, her voice steady but firm. "Officers Derek Connolly and James Morris, this court has reviewed the evidence against you and finds that your actions on the night in question were unlawful, abusive, and driven by racial bias." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The officers stiffened. Their lawyer opened his mouth, but she continued before he could speak. "This is not the first time you have engaged in such behavior," she said. "Your records show repeated instances of racial profiling, excessive force, and false reports. You have hidden behind your badges, using them as weapons rather than symbols of protection. But today, that ends." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their hands clenching into fists at their sides. "This court finds you guilty of unlawful detainment, excessive use of force, and misconduct in office," she declared, her voice unwavering. "Officer Connolly, Officer Morris, you are hereby stripped of your positions in law enforcement, effective immediately." A gasp erupted from the back of the courtroom. The officers' eyes widened in shock. They had expected a suspension, sensitivity training, maybe even probation. But this was unthinkable. The judge wasn't finished. "Additionally, I am recommending criminal charges be pursued against you for your actions that night." She glanced at the prosecutor, who gave a slight nod. "You will not walk away from this unscathed." Connolly shook his head, his face red with frustration. "Your Honor, this isn't fair. She raised a hand, silencing him. "Fair?" she echoed, her gaze cutting into him like a blade. "Was it fair when you threw me into the back of your cruiser without cause? Was it fair when you humiliated me on the street, assuming I was just another powerless black woman?" His mouth snapped shut. She looked at them one last time. "This is justice, and for once, it applies to you too." The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The officers stood frozen, their expressions shifting between disbelief and fury. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on them like an anvil. No badge to shield them, no system to cover for them, no loophole to slip through. For the first time in their careers, they were being held accountable. The judge gathered her papers with slow precision, her face unreadable. The gavel had fallen, the decision final. But she knew this moment was bigger than just two officers losing their jobs. It was a crack in the foundation of a system that had protected men like them for far too long. As the courtroom began to empty, a few reporters hurried outside, already preparing their headlines. Court officers escorted the disgraced former policeman out through the back, their shoulders stiff with the weight of humiliation. The people in the audience, many of them black, many of them survivors of similar mistreatment, watched with quiet satisfaction. The judge stepped down from the bench, her back straight, her footsteps steady as she walked through the halls of the courthouse. Colleagues passed her, some nodding in approval, others keeping their heads down, unwilling to acknowledge what had just happened. She understood. Change made people uncomfortable. Outside, a crowd had gathered. News cameras flashed. People held signs, some calling for deeper reform, some simply celebrating the rare sight of justice being served against law enforcement. A woman stepped forward, an older black woman with streaks of gray in her hair and lines of experience etched into her face. "You did what they never do," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The judge met her gaze and nodded. It was time. More people came forward, shaking her hand, thanking her. Not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been stopped unfairly, mistreated, or silenced. The officers' firing sent ripples through the department. Internal investigations reopened. Policies were questioned. The public demanded more transparency, more accountability. Some officers grumbled, seeing it as an attack on their profession. Others, the ones who had long watched corruption fester in silence, saw it as an opportunity to do better. Weeks later, the city council proposed new legislation, mandatory racial bias training, stricter oversight for officers with multiple complaints, and a new division dedicated to investigating cases of misconduct. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Late one evening, the The judge sat in her office, staring out the window as the city hummed below. She thought of all the cases that had come before this one, all the names that never got justice. She knew this wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't erase the years of pain, the lives lost, the trust broken. But tonight, she had done something that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the first step towards something bigger.